Welcome back. I'm Elizabeth Johnson and this is Shakespeare Guildmaster, Week 2, Lesson 1. And today we're talking about Iambic Pentameter and blank verse. I'm going to quote actor David Suchet. Speaking in rhyme is not natural to us, but it was to the Elizabethans. So we have to understand what language meant to them and what language does not mean to us today. If I were an Elizabethan and I wanted to impress you as a lover, I wouldn't send you flowers. I would come and woo you at your feet and recite to you a sonnet I had written just for you, no matter how bad it was. Elizabethan England was a world where people sang, talked, and breathed language. In Elizabethan times, when people went to go to a play, they talked about going to hear a play. When we go to a play today, we say we're going to see a play. Now, most average people in Shakespeare's time and through most of history were illiterate, but it didn't stop them from going to hear a play. They lived in a very auditory world. In fact, that term audio or auditory is where we get the word audience from. People through much of history have used language and verse. They have shared knowledge about how to grow crops, how to stitch clothing properly. They have taught children morals and religious principles through the use of poetry and memorizing lengthy passages and songs. So people used their ears and listened and memorized and had a lot of knowledge that sometimes we don't give them a lot of credit for having. But people have generally been very intelligent, but have used their ears much more than we rely on today. Now, when I'm talking about the word meter in poetry, that word meter is derived from the Greek word for measure, metron, and denotes the measured rhythm of a line of poetry. Now, just like in a word, if I'm saying a word like trailer or pillow, the smallest measure of a rhythm in a poem is a syllable, just like the smallest sound of a word is a syllable. Each syllable in a poem is accented or unaccented. In the following examples, accented syllables are marked with a stress and unaccented syllables are marked with a breve. Now I'm going to tell you what an iamb is. This is IAMB. It's simply a weak syllable followed by a strong syllable. So there are some words in English or short phrases that are iambs. Words like exist, belong, predict, or phrases like the one, I can't. So now we're going to look at a few different kinds of iambic meters in poetry. But before we do that, we're going to talk about scanning a poem for feet. When I'm scanning a poem, I'm trying to find out the pattern of the rhythm. I'm listening to the stressed and unstressed syllables. Now, when I normally read a poem just for enjoyment, I'm not going to read it this way, just when I'm trying to figure out what the meter is. Usually, it's a good idea to scan the first 3 or 4 lines in a poem before deciding its meter, because sometimes a poet will mix it up just for variety. We'll talk more about foot type and number of feet per line in other literature classes later. For now, we're just interested in iambs and iambic pentameter. So remember, an iamb is simply a weak beat followed by a strong beat. Now I'm going to read this poem by Emily Dickinson. It's written in iambic trimeter or trimeter, which includes 3 iambs or 6 syllables per line. On the next slide, it will be much more clear, but I'm just going to read it straightforward right now. The only news I know is bulletins all day from immortality. The only shows I see, tomorrow and today, perchance eternity. So now you see the slide that shows each iamb being separated by a vertical line, and you see the stress marks and the breves above the words. And I'm going to read it with the stresses. The only news I know is bulletins all day from immortality. The only shows I see, tomorrow and today, perchance eternity. This next example by William Wordsworth is in Iambic Tetrameter. So there are 4 iambs per line, 8 syllables. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er dales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils. Here's the same poem with the iambs divided up and the stressed and unstressed syllables. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er dales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils. And then finally we come to Iambic Pentameter. We have 5 iambs per line, which equals 10 syllables. This poem is by Robert Frost, who wrote a great deal of poetry in Iambic Pentameter, as did William Shakespeare. I'm going to read this poem. I have been one acquainted with the night. I have walked out in rain and back in rain. I have outwalked the furthest city light. I have looked down the saddest city lane. Now with the stresses. I have been one acquainted with the night. I have walked out in rain and back in rain. I have outwalked the furthest city light. I have looked down the saddest city lane. If I just want to feel the rhythm of this, it makes a sound of da-dum, 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 da-dum. Now here is an example from Shakespeare. It is part of a passage that we're going to be memorizing soon, and you probably have already heard this. This is Romeo, and he's saying, "But soft, what light through yonder window breaks? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. Arise, fair sun, and kill the envious moon, who is already sick and pale with grief." Here's the same passage, and you can see the iambs broken up. I'm going to read it with the stresses. But soft, what light through yonder window breaks? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. Arise, fair sun, and kill the envious moon, who is already sick and pale with grief. Now, we talked at the beginning how in the intro, this lesson is about iambic pentameter and blank verse. Blank verse is simply having several lines of unrhymed iambic pentameter. So there's no rhyming words at the ends of the lines that create this rhyme scheme. Now, Shakespeare did sometimes use rhymes in some of his plays and in poetry, but for the most part, his plays are full of blank verse. Not all blank verse reads like da-dum, 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 or shall I compare thee to a summer's day. There are some variations, and we will talk about those later. Also, some lines might only have 9 syllables, or they might have extras like 11 or 12. We will talk later about what actors do with these lines. And you're going to find yourself counting syllables throughout Shakespeare's plays, in your normal conversations, in novels you read, and in poetry. And all I can say is, you're welcome. Now, one of my favorite passages in blank verse written by Shakespeare comes from King Richard II. And you're going to see this passage in week 4 when you read that play. I'm just going to read it to you, and I want you to just kind of listen to the syllables and follow along on the screen, just paying attention to the fact that we mainly have lines that have, for the most part, 10 syllables, and that the ends of the lines don't rhyme. And when I look at it, I see some poetry. When I speak it, maybe I don't hear it as much, but this would have been a useful tool for an actor to have in memorizing lines. So here's King Richard. For God's sake, let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings. how some have been deposed, some slain in war, some haunted by the ghosts they have deposed, some poisoned by their wives, some sleeping killed, all murdered. For within the hollow crown that rounds the mortal temples of a king keeps death his court, and there the antic sits, scoffing his state and grinning at his pomp, allowing him a breath, a little seen to monarch eyes, be feared and kill with looks, infusing him with self and vain conceit, as if this flesh which walls about our life were brass impregnable, and humored thus comes at the last and with a little pin bores through his castle wall, and farewell, king. Now, iambic pentameter became very popular on the public stage in the 16th century. It was used by many playwrights. It was also used in court frequently. It was considered too intellectual for the masses, but it was frequently used by playwrights and people in court. A nice thing about iambic pentameter is that you can speak a full line of it with it sounding fairly natural, and it follows the flow of naturally spoken English. I'm going to say a line of iambic pentameter in English. I'm going to the store to buy some eggs. I'm going to the store to buy some eggs. Now, it's pretty easy to memorize a line of iambic pentameter and to work in the breath that you need to do. Now, for actors who performed 6 or 7 plays a week and had to have several plays memorized at once, this was very helpful, as I mentioned before, in helping to memorize. Your assignments for this week are to finish reading Romeo and Juliet, Acts 2 through 3 by the 4th lesson. Continue working on your memorization of Romeo and Juliet, the prologue, and have fun counting iambic pentameter in your sleep. That's all I've got for today. I'll see you next time.